This is my commodity research project, and the commodity I will be doing is coffee. So let's get started. What exactly is coffee? Well, coffee itself is a brewed drink, which is obtained by extracting in water the soluble components from the roasted pits of the coffee cherry. Coffee is a beverage with a variable percentage of caffeine and a specific aroma and taste. And coffee is actually one of the most valuable and traded commodities in the world. So where does coffee come from? Well, many people think that coffee beans come from a plant, but coffee beans are actually the pits or the seeds of the coffee tree fruit. Here are two of the most widely produced and demanded coffee beans, which are the Arabica and Robusta beans. And coffee itself is the result of brewing and roasting these beans. Now, let's look at the history of coffee. The earliest credible evidence of the coffee drinking or knowledge of the coffee tree appears in the middle of the 15th century in Yemen. Now, it was here in Arabia that coffee seeds were first roasted and brewed in a similar way to how it is prepared today. Coffee was used by the Muslim community for its stimulant powers, which proved useful during long prayer sessions. Accounts differ on the origin of the coffee plant prior to its appearance in Yemen. In fact, tradition says that not a single coffee plant existed outside of Arabia or Africa until the 1600s, when an Indian pilgrim left Mecca with fertile beans fastened to a strap across his abdomen. This pilgrim's beans resulted in a new and competitive European coffee trade. Now, in the 17th century, European travelers by the Near East brought back stories of an unusual dark beverage, and coffee had made its way to Europe and was becoming popular across the continent. In the 18th century, coffee plants reached the New World, and though the drink wasn't really popular in America until the Boston Tea Party of 1773, which making the switch from tea to coffee became something of a patriotic duty. The Civil War and other conflicts that followed also helped to increase coffee consumption, as soldiers relied on the caffeine for a boost of energy. By the late 19th century, coffee had become a worldwide commodity, and entrepreneurs began looking for new ways to profit from the popular beverage. In the 1960s, a certain awareness for specialty coffee started to grow, which inspired the opening of the first Starbucks in Seattle in 1971. And today, the grassroots coffee movement continues to grow with the increase of small, independently owned cafes boasting sustainable, locally roasted fair trade beans. Now let's look at the production and supply of coffee, specifically how coffee is produced and where it's produced. Now, first, we have 5 steps in the whole production of coffee from beans to the beverage we know and love. First, in regards to planting and harvesting, a coffee plant can take up to 5 years, typically 3 to 4 years, to produce its precious fruit, and it cannot grow in every climate. Coffee seeds are generally planted in large beds in shaded nurseries. The seedlings will be watered frequently and shaded from bright sunlight until they are hardy enough to be permanently planted. Planting often takes place during the wet season so that the soil remains moist while the roots become firmly established. The berries are typically harvested by a machine or picked by hand. Whether by hand or by machine, all coffee is harvested in one of 2 ways. They're either strip picked, where all of the cherries are stripped off of the branch at one time, or selectively picked, where only the ripe cherries are harvested, and they are individually picked by hand. So, second, in processing the cherries, in order to get the beans out, the fruit of the berry needs to be removed, and the beans need to be processed. So there are only 2 known ways of processing beans: dry processing, which is an older technique, and wet processing, which is a more modern technique. Now, dry processing is where the beans are placed in the sun and left to dry for around 2 weeks, while being turned from time to time so they can dry evenly. And wet processing is a modern method of processing beans, and it takes place soon after the harvest. So this coffee harvesting process consists of washing and fermentation. During this process, the pulp that is left on the beans will become softer and the pulp will be rinsed off. 3. In milling the beans, we use hulling machinery, which removes the parchment layer from wet processed coffee fruits, and hulling dry processed coffee fruits refers to removing the entire husk of the dried cherries. Then polishing, which is an optional process where any silver skin that remains on the beans after hulling is removed by machine. Then grading and sorting is done by size and weight, and beans are also reviewed for color flaws and other imperfections. Beans are sized by being passed through a series of screens. They are also sorted pneumatically by using an air jet to separate heavy from light beans. And finally, the defective beans are removed either by hand or by machinery. 4. In exporting the beans, the milled beans, which are now referred to as green coffee, are loaded onto ships in either jute or sisal bags, loaded in shipping containers, or bulk shipped inside plastic-lined containers. And last, we have to prepare our coffee beverage. We either roast the coffee, so we have to roast the coffee, which transforms green coffee into the aromatic brown beans that we purchase in our favorite stores or cafes. And after roasting, the beans are immediately cooled either by air or water. And roasting is generally performed by the importing countries because freshly roasted beans must reach the consumer as quickly as possible. And then grinding the coffee, which gives the coffee its good flavor. And then one would brew the coffee into the beverage that we know and love. So where primarily are our coffee beans supplied? In order to produce a good harvest, the coffee trees will require special care with the attention to the soil. This limits where coffee is grown, but the climate where trees grow is typically a warm climate of subtropical regions and equatorial regions like Latin America or the Caribbean. So the largest supplier of coffee beans is in Brazil, with over 2.6 million metric tons of coffee beans supplied. Vietnam is second with over 1.5 million metric tons. Colombia third at over 750,000 metric tons. Indonesia fourth with over 660,000 metric tons. And then Honduras is fifth with over 475,000 metric tons. So this is a general map of all the countries that supply coffee. With the larger the circle, the more they supply. And you can see the largest circles are around Brazil and Vietnam. Now let's look at the production companies and organizations primarily in Brazil. And these organizations house coffee scientists, in which they focus on a variety of different things. For starters, productivity per plant was the main goal, but then with time, techniques that reduce production costs and new ways to fight plagues and diseases were the focal point of their research. And sustainability and quality are some current targets for Brazilian scientists. Now let's look at the production in Vietnam, which is the second biggest supplier of coffee beans in the world. Now they have advances in machinery to cut costs for farmers and keep coffee production in Vietnam consistent compared with their other competitors. Reducing the labor-intensive strip picking with automotive and mechanical harvesters has become the norm. Even handmade equipment serves farmers by reducing damage to trees. Investing in technology to improve sustainability practices contributes to the national output in Vietnam. Now, irrigation has a significant impact on coffee plantations due to water stress. Less water and pesticide use means a higher yield for farmers without paying more to combat the effects of climate change. Vietnam has been ahead of other competitors regarding sustainable coffee production, but cooperatives have utilized sustainable strategies such as planting nitrogen-fixing crops alongside coffee plants. This enhances the fertility of the soil. Now, coffee exportation is done in this general order, from the origin country and its farmers to different organizations through an intermediary. They go to exporters. From the exporters go directly to the importers, and then they go to the roasters that roast the coffee beans and then brew it for people like us. Now, here are some of the variety of coffee products that can be created from coffee beans. Now, there are different ways of preparing coffee to be sold or to be brewed at home. And individuals generally brew coffee generally from Arabica beans to give us our commonly known black coffee, but Robusta beans are used in espresso drinks and instant coffee mixes. So here are some of the specialty coffees you may have heard of, including lattes, cappuccinos, americanos, espressos, macchiatos, and mochas, as well as other specialty coffees that may not be as common, but the rest of them are listed here on this chart. Now, the demand of coffee. Let's talk about that. Here are the top coffee companies in the world. And at first, of course, we have Starbucks with a revenue of $22 billion, over $22 billion. Now, today Starbucks has over 27,000 stores worldwide, with a third of these located overseas. Between 1987 and 2007, the coffee business opened an average of 2 stores every day. Now next, second place, we have Tim Hortons at $30 billion, really far away from Starbucks, and it's primarily sourced in Canada. Now third, we have Panera Bread at $2.8 billion. Now this company was founded in Missouri as St. Louis Bread in 1987, but then the firm was bought in 1993, transforming it to Panera Bread in 1997. At fourth place, we have Lavazza at $2.4 billion. This is the oldest of the 5 companies, founded in Italy in 1895, and the company has a fleet of coffee shops and stores sold coffee beans in 90 countries. The brand is championed as Italy's favorite coffee. And at fifth place, we have Costa Coffee at $1.7 billion. This is UK's version of Starbucks, with 2,200 stores throughout the United Kingdom, with a further 1,280 stores overseas. Here are the countries with the highest coffee demand. This chart only shows those for 2020. We can see how coffee is rather highly demanded in developed countries. And though this is only for 2020, we see that Netherlands has claimed the top spot. But for all time, Finland is actually the #1 coffee consuming country in the world. So Finland would be the country with the highest coffee consumption and coffee demand in the world. Now let's look at some of the factors that affect supply and demand in the coffee market. First, with the climatic conditions, there's persistent drought conditions exacerbated by the El Nino weather system, which could damage crops around the world and cause a spike in the crop's price. Now, dryness in Brazil and Indonesia, the first and third largest producers of coffee beans, appears to be intensified by El Nino, so it is currently already happening, and this endangers the production of coffee beans. So in Colombia, the second largest producer of Arabica beans after Brazil, El Nino-related dryness seems poised to worsen an already intense drought, which could damage the country's output. And a warming climate causes the coffee plant to have smaller blooms, low flowering and fruiting, and warmer temperatures make the coffee plants more susceptible to coffee pests. And rising temperatures and new rain patterns are limiting the areas where Arabica beans can be grown, because the plant itself is very sensitive to weather inconsistencies. Global temperatures are expected to increase by 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius over the next few decades, which causes experts to believe that major coffee-producing countries will see a serious loss in harvest. Brazil alone can expect its current Arabica production to drop by 25% by 2050 if they do not change their production methods. Now we can see from the supply and demand graph that the supply will clearly decrease based on global warming. This will lead to the price increasing for coffee beans as there will be less supplied, and then the price increasing will cause the quantity demanded of coffee beans to decrease. Now, this is a non-price determinant of time, as climate change is currently seemingly irreversible, and it will just get worse as time goes by, and this will definitely increase the supply of coffee beans. Now next, with growing demand in emerging nations as their incomes rise, coffee consumption is increasing in all countries throughout the world. Now, there will always be an increasing demand for coffee. As these nations are becoming more developed, people are continuing to have steady incomes. Now with the increases in income, people will look to popular coffee beverages. So Asian countries such as Japan and China also mostly have the most increasing number of coffee drinkers. And the largest increase in coffee consumption is that of the Japanese, which is 30% in 20 years. And consumption in China has grown by 16% per year over the last 10 years, which makes China the 17th largest coffee consumer in the world. And this is a non-price determinant of income. As people's incomes will be increasing, their demand for coffee would also increase. You can see the demand curve shift to the right. As the quantity demanded increases, the price of coffee would also increase accordingly. Now last, we have the prices of coffee substitutes. Now coffee's primary substitute, tea, has seen decreases in price worldwide, and this leads to the overall decrease in demand for coffee as its primary substitute, tea, has decreased in price, therefore raising the demand for tea. Now you can see as the volume of tea consumption per year is steadily increasing. And you can see how the price of tea has been steadily decreasing over the past few years. And that would lead to the demand for coffee to decrease as the demand for tea would increase. And as tea is a prime substitute for coffee, more people might transition from coffee to tea, which then leads to less people wanting coffee. And as less people want coffee, the quantity demanded of it decreases, then the price would also decrease. Now, how has COVID-19 affected the coffee market? Well, the coffee market is actually one of the ones that survived very well through the global recession. With an output of 67.9 million bags of coffee, each weighing 60 kilograms, 2020 and 2021 is set to be the best year on record for coffee production in Brazil, which is up more than 3 million bags compared to the previous on-year for Arabica beans. Now, as Jose says, the impact of COVID on coffee production is actually relatively minor. And he himself is an executive director of the International Coffee Organization, so we know we can listen to him. And governments have moved to safeguard workers because they declared coffee production as an essential economic activity. So despite the difficulties finding sufficient migrant labor, even much smaller coffee-producing countries like Ethiopia, which exports about 4 million bags of coffee per year, they have been largely able to continue production as planned. And lastly, we have coffee grocery sales, which increased by 23% in the first full week of lockdown in Italy, as many things have, but unfortunately smaller cafes and coffee roasters still had to close down. But overall, the coffee market is going very strong, and that is all. Thank you for listening.